Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 19th of February 2018. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Thank you, Mike.
We're going to get straight on with Brexit. Well, the Express here saying they threaten and threaten. Brexit here reveals how EU will crumble in Brexit talks. This is Bernard Jenkin, who's apparently saying that, there are a number of issues like fishing and agriculture where there'll be divergence during the implementation period. In the end, the European Union survives because the European Parliament usually draws back from the brink of bringing the whole house down from something they threaten and threaten, but they don't in the end because actually their democratic mandate is very thin. So we've got this charade being played out. In the meantime, reports that Mr. Juncker is seeking post-Brexit unity because EU leaders are getting involved in more and more fights. EU leaders, according to this article, it says, face difficult talks this week on the thorny issues of how to plug holes in the post-Brexit budget and choose a successor for the European Commission chief Jean-Claude Juncker. A special one-day summit in Brussels on Friday, this coming Friday, of the 27 leaders without Britain is meant to be a key step in the roadmap to a leaner and more unified bloc after Britain leaves in just over a year. But cracks have already appeared between French President Emmanuel Macron leading the charge for a reformed Europe and Juncker with his federalist approach or federalist vision of how top EU officials should be chosen in the future. Now, we're going to talk about Theresa May in a second and what she's doing with Brexit. But the line that I found very interesting here was that the cracks have appeared between Macron, who's leading the charge for a reformed Europe. Now, of course, we've got to remember that the European leader who was leading the charge for a reformed Europe was David Cameron.
That's right.
In the lead up to the referendum, just before he presented his Best of Both Worlds document, which was based on the notion that Britain would have a new relationship within a reformed European Union. Then the vote goes and Brexit is the winner. Apparently Britain is going to have a new relationship with the European Union within a reformed European Union indeed, as Macron is pushing forward for this. So once again, we see that actually it's difficult to see the difference between these two positions.
And what David Cameron laid out in that document, and we encourage everybody to go read that, which was presented on the same day that he announced, called the referendum date in February of 2016. And that's really a blueprint of where Britain is going to be with Europe in the future, and that is now.
Yes.
So this is a very relevant document, even though it's been labeled, Mike, as sort of canceled out. It's very relevant indeed.
Absolutely right. Now, the deal that keeps us safe, this is what the UK government was pushing out this morning. It says the UK accounts for around 40% of all EU member states spending on defence, research and development. And of course, this little slide that they've pushed out was following Theresa May speaking at the Munich Security Conference at the weekend. Patrick, now, just tell me a little bit about the Munich Security Conference, because it's one of those sort of annual meetings that sort of passes most people by and they don't quite understand what it is.
Well, it is important on one level, is it's unique. Munich Security Conference going since 1963, so I think this would be its 55th year. And so this is unique because in this gathering you have heads of state, you have MPs, you have military leaders, and you also have international organizations and NGOs all together. So in attendance, United States representatives, Europe, EU, European countries, Iran, China, Russia even, and NATO representatives as well. So in terms of a forum, Mike, this is probably the most inclusive sort of security and defense forum internationally. However, the downside of this, Mike, is, by the way, Henry Kissinger launched this back in '63. And so the downside is this has become kind of like the security Davos. It's just a talking shop. And a lot of what goes on here, although it's good for people to meet and greet, you'll see absolutely the opposite tomorrow when they leave, back to war footing and aggressive talk and threats and so forth, especially between Britain, certain European leaders, and Russia, and the United States and Russia. So in a sense, it's kind of like the Davos, the security blob. So like the foreign policy blob, this is the security blob, and this will be the sort of the Davos of global security?
Well, our illustrious leader was speaking at the weekend at the Munich Security Conference, and I'm going to just spend a little bit of time on this because there's quite a lot of what she said that's quite important if people want to understand what's going on with Brexit. She said that the fundamental values that we share, respect for human dignity, human rights, freedom, democracy and equality, have created common cause to act together in our shared interest. The rules-based system we helped to develop has enabled global cooperation to protect these shared values today. As globalization brings nations together as never before, we face a host of new and growing threats and that seek to undermine those rules and values. So she is once again talking about this rules-based international order. She's saying that globalization is bringing nations closer together, but the rules-based international order faces greater threats that undermine those rules and values. Well, how many people understand what the rules and values of the rules-based international order are? You've been looking at this recently.
Yeah, so it's a relative concept, and if you notice, Theresa May's kept it very vague, not offering a lot of specifics, because of course when you do that, this is when you get into trouble. So in terms of the rules-based international order, the rules actually don't apply, especially to the United States, to NATO member states, and to Israel, for instance. The rules absolutely do not apply. So international law doesn't apply, and they can kind of get up to anything, even if it's in total violation of the UN Charter. So one is scratching their head wondering, what exactly is Theresa May talking about?
So we go on. Then she said, the fundamental values, for our part, the United States has always, For our part, the United Kingdom has always understood that our security and prosperity is bound to global security and prosperity. We are a global nation, enriching global prosperity through centuries of trade. Now, were you aware, Patrick, that we had enriched other countries through centuries of trade? Or had we, in fact, over the centuries, looted other countries to enrich ourselves?
Well, the empire was certainly enriched, and I guess it was, well, history is kind of clear on that, Mike.
A bit of revisionism going on there. But anyway, through the talents of our people and by exchanging learning and culture with partners across the world, and we invest in global security, knowing this is how we best protect our people at home and abroad. She said, and within Europe, we're working ever more closely with our European partners, bringing the influence and impact that comes from our full range of global relationships. And we want to continue this cooperation as we leave the European Union. So we're going to continue this cooperation. So as we leave the EU, she said, and forge a new path for ourselves and the world, the UK is just as committed to Europe's security in the future as we have been in the past. Europe's security is our security. That is what I've said, and I said again today that the United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining it. The challenge for us all today is finding the way to work together through a deep and special partnership between the UK and the EU. So there we go again, the deep and special partnership and this unconditional commitment. It always fascinated me that when we talk about the best of both worlds document and David Cameron's proposal for the UK's relationship within a reformed European Union, that security and defence was never part of that. It was everything else. It was trade, it was farming, it was every other thing. But European defence is an unconditional commitment. It's not something that can be negotiated, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it probably left out intentionally on that occasion, simply because the enormity of that in terms of European military integration totally changes the EU as it stands today, and the big sovereignty issues come into play when we have collective defense budgets. We have a collective foreign policy. Imagine that. This is a big change, and that could transform the UN Security Council as well. These are issues that should be really being debated vigorously right now, Mike, but it doesn't seem that they are.
No.
Which is a little bit worrying.
So let's go on. She went on to say, when Justice and Home Affairs ceased to be an intergovernmental and became a shared EU competence, of course there were some in the UK who would have us adopt the EU's approach wholesale, just as there were some who would have had us rejected outright. As Home Secretary, I was determined to find a practical and pragmatic way in which the UK and EU could continue to cooperate on our common security. That is why I reviewed each provision in turn and successfully made the case for the UK to opt back into those that were clearly in our national interest. I think that is a very key statement that she's made there, because what she's saying is that she has a history of presenting a position. Okay, we're leaving. She's saying we're leaving the EU. This is the idea that's being proposed anyway. But that she has a history of making the case to opt back into institutions. This is something that she's been talking about since the referendum, really, since the referendum result. This is one of the reasons why I find it difficult to separate what David Cameron was proposing and her position today. They look identical to me. She went on the things we might lose, because she was really concerned about the things we might lose. First, our practical cooperation, including our expedited extradition and mutual legal assistance relationship. The European arrest warrant is another thing that we might lose, according to her. It's played a crucial role in supporting police cooperation between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which has been a fundamental part of political settlement there. Something else we might lose is cooperation between our law enforcement agency, which means that the UK is one of the biggest contributors of data, information and expertise to Europol. Through the Schengen Information System too, the UK is contributing to the sharing of real-time data on wanted criminals, missing persons and suspected terrorists. And finally, she said the UK has also driven a pan-EU approach to processing passenger data on flights. So she's concerned that those are things that we might lose if we're not careful. And so she says that she recognises that there's no existing security agreement between the EU as a third country that captures the full depth and breadth of her existing relationship, but that there is precedent and there's no legal or operational reason why such an agreement could not be reached in the area of internal security. If the priority in the negotiations becomes avoiding any kind of new cooperation with a country outside the EU, then this political doctrine and ideology will have damaging real-world consequences. As leaders, we cannot let that happen. So what she's saying is we cannot exit the European Union, effectively.
She's leaving the door open to opt back in. And so, as I said before, I think this appears like a holding pattern. Look at this Prime Minister. Did she look like she's really serious about leaving the EU? It doesn't come across.
No, well, she's not, of course. She said, that's why I proposed a new treaty to underpin our future internal security relationship. The treaty must preserve our operational capabilities, but it must also fulfill three further requirements. It must be respectful of the sovereignty of both the UK and the EU legal orders. So, for example, when participating in EU agencies, the UK will respect the remit of the European Court of Justice. Now, this has been a key part of the Brexit campaign, that the European Court of Justice should have no further jurisdiction over UK matters. And yet what she has said once again here is that where we choose to opt in, that we will of course respect the remit of the European Court of Justice. So how can there be Brexit under those circumstances? There can't. She went on to say, as I've said before, we need to agree a strong and appropriate form of independent dispute resolution across all areas of our future partnership in which both sides have necessary confidence. And she said that it is only by strengthening and deepening the full range of partnerships within Europe and beyond that we will be able to respond together to the evolving threats that we face, because we've got all these threats of terrorism and so on. That means doing more to develop bilateral cooperation between European nations, as I was pleased to do with President Macron at last month's UK-France summit. We need a partnership that respects both the decision-making autonomy of the European Union and the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. Based on everything else that she said in this speech, it is not possible, Patrick, to have a partnership that respects both the decision-making abilities of the European Union and the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. Something has to be given up.
No, she's trying to hedge the conversation there, and it's not coming across very sincere. But two takeaways I just want to add to this conference. One was a statement by the German defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen, saying Germany must bear a larger burden for the common security of the Atlantic chasm. So this is interesting. So Germany wanting to assert itself militarily in this new, either this European collective defense framework or possibly in NATO, And so also U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Nicholas Burns, former, said, will NATO strengthen itself to contain Russian power in Eastern Europe, given what Russia has done illegally in Crimea, Donbass, and in Georgia? I think the answer is positive. NATO defense ministers have determined that they'll increase their findings, and we have troops in Poland and 3 Baltic countries. NATO is unified, and so pushing back the Russian threat. And all 3 of those examples he's named there are tagged as Russian aggression. It's now common now. It's being repeated over and over. If you look at each of those cases, Crimea, Donbass, and Georgia, you'll find that Russia didn't invade Georgia, didn't invade the Donbass, and didn't invade Crimea. But it's been spun in a way that's convenient to NATO to put this across. But the Russian minister, their ambassador to NATO, Alexander Grushko, is basically calling that security is something that must be shared by everyone. In other words, your security has to also respect my security as well. That is, to me, good diplomatic language in general. But this is not the way it's being framed from the Western point of view. This is the source of a lot of problems, I think.
Okay, well, let's move on to Russia then. And Sergei Lavrov was giving an interview to Euronews over the weekend. If you want to find it, the headline is Sergei Lavrov on Russian-US relations and the Middle East. It was a 20-minute interview. The program, it was called Global Conversation. And he said it's quite clear. He was talking about the Russia-US relationships, and he's particularly concerned about the Democratic Party in the United States. He said it's quite clear that the Democrats can't reconcile themselves to the defeat, the 2016 election, of course, that caught them fully by surprise, and now they're going out of their way to poison life for President Trump and the entire Republican Party. But for Trump in the first place, of course, since he's the leader from outside of the system, they're failing to do it to the extent that they want. Trump has confirmed more than once his genuine intention to fulfill everything he spoke about during the election race, including the promotion of normal, respectful, mutually beneficial and advantageous relations with Russia. He said, unfortunately, that hasn't quite happened. It's a pity that under Donald Trump, for more than a year of his presidency, our relationships have not improved compared to the period of the Democratic administration, even worsened to a certain extent. He said, I do hope the predominant tendencies we're witnessing in Washington now will fade away there somewhat. It's clear, though, that this shouldn't be expected before the midterms in November, because the struggling for seats in the US Congress and gubernatorial positions are already in full swing. He went on to, of course, deny the latest allegations of Russia that are made under Russiagate. He said the authors of the Russiagate operation have cornered themselves. There's much talk about state interference in the electoral process, but I haven't seen a single fact to date. A US Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security supervising cybersecurity and said unambiguously a few days ago they didn't have any evidence of Russia's interference in the last presidential race. The situation where you've no facts, where no facts have leaked to the public sphere over almost half a year, that the investigation in progress is simply impossible for the US. If there were at least some smouldering smoke, you would have seen it at least once. I think they've cornered themselves by declarations about precise data on Russians meddling, and now they're trying to at least produce some retroactive justifications, but they're still floundering. He went on to mention the seizure of Russian diplomatic property in the United States, Patrick, and was talking about taking legal action in the US to try to deal with that.
Yeah, and that they announced they were going to do that when the United States effectively kicked them out of their consulate in San Francisco, and I think there was another property, adjunct property, and there's also a site in Washington, D.C. as well, which I think they're releasing. But this is outrageous what the U.S. did, was, kicking a major UN Security Council member out of the country, effectively out of their embassy. It's unprecedented, unless in times of war. So Russia will have a good case if they do take this legally, and they should be successful, even in a U.S. court. This is going to be interesting if this does go to court, Mike, to see how this plays out, because they might have to produce some some provenance for the accusations of meddling. So this will be interesting. This is Obama, by the way.
Yeah.
This is all laid at Obama's feet.
And finally, on Lavrov, then he was again talking about the U.S. military presence in Syria. He said it's clear the United States has some strategy which I believe entails staying in Syria forever with its armed forces. They're gearing up for separating a huge part of Syria from the rest of the country, violating Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They will create quasi-local authorities. Will try to create autonomy based on the Kurds. So still a concern for the Russians.
Look, what the United States is doing in Syria is now Lavrov has laid out the game plan basically in public. So they're already changing street signs in Raqqa, Mike, to add Kurdish language. So that these are not all dominated Kurdish areas. They've been depopulated, and so now the Kurds have come in with U.S. backing, and they're hoping to create a breakaway state to tear a piece of Syria off. It's going to be very difficult. And I might add as well, with the Israeli jet that was shot down by Syria, who mediated this a couple of days ago? Netanyahu had to call Vladimir Putin. And so this is a huge historic change. For 50, 60 years, the United States was mediating all major disputes regarding Israel and in this region. So in terms of foreign policy, and we discussed this with Marwa Osman on the Sunday Wire last night, amazing interview. And so she really laid out the logistics diplomatically of this. And this is a historic shift, Mike, geopolitically.
Sticking with the Russian situation then, this is The Hill, and the headline is Russian bots flood Twitter with pro-gun messages after Florida shooting report.
This is ridiculous. So this is a bit of fake news here. So according to Wired magazine, Russian bots, and now they use the term kind of loosely, Russian bots, could be Russian government, Russian linked, Russian influenced bots or whatever, under the control or indirect control of Vladimir Putin have flooded Twitter with pro-gun messages to besmirch the victims of the Florida school shooting. So this is propaganda, effectively. By the way, this was retweeted by Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, former wife of Cass Sunstein. So she's tweeting out fake news and conspiracy theories. And meanwhile, her husband, who wrote the Obama Doctrine on how to manage the internet and how to deal with all the conspiracy theorists, Cass Sunstein. It's interesting that Samantha Power would be pushing that bit of fake news. This is just the total insanity of the U.S. Political system right now. Everyone's lost their mind over Russiagate.
But America's under attack, according to The Atlantic.
Well, according to The Atlantic, yes, America's under attack. This article is an absolute exhibit A. What they've done here is combine Russiagate with the Florida school shooting. So this is what is going on now. So they are so desperate to nail Trump by hook or crook. And in this case, they'll do and mix and match anything they can to try to create some sort of crisis for Trump. And they're saying Trump doesn't care. The Russians are attacking us. The Russians are pushing gun culture in America. Can you believe that? The Russians would be pushing gun. You don't need anybody to push gun culture in America. I can tell you that right now. This is just imbecilic. This is as we said last night, the golden age of stupid in America. So we're hoping it's peaking now because, as we discussed, I would hate to see it get any dumber than this, because then that would be something really frightening. This is bad enough.
But Julian Assange seems to have nailed it.
Listen, say what you want, and he has his critics, but I have to say this. Julian Assange has just laid out an absolute scathing slam dunk basically over the Robert Mueller investigation, the indictment of these 13 Russian trolls who no one will ever see and will never see a courtroom in America. So Assange has laid it out beautifully. Buried in the Mueller astroturfing indictment is something that we have long suspected. This shadowy internet research agency, Troll Farm, is geared to develop audience in socially active communities, i.e. through aligned memes, these are memes, internet memes, in order to spam them on behalf of anybody who is willing to pay. Okay, this is a social media operation for profit. Okay.
And he went on.
Yeah, but so before advertising networks can advertise, they need to build an audience. We all know this who work in media. So how much of the Internet Research Agency's activities were simply trying to build audiences by gaining followers. How do you gain followers on the internet these days?
With tweets and memes.
Tweets and memes are the biggest thing to get friends and to develop traffic on Twitter. So that's all they were doing, and likely to be shared in those communities. Obviously, this is like Internet 101, okay? So this seems to have escaped the Mueller investigation and the great DOJ Assistant Attorney General Rosenstein. So the Internet Research Agency allegedly also ran kitten appreciation groups. Are we also to believe that these kittens were also a plot to divide in America into so chaos, as they said in the indictment? So to not distinguish between the audience building and customer advertising payload is sketchy. That's an understatement. Assange goes on. This puts it into perspective. The U.S. has 320 million people with a $1 trillion media and culture sector that employs millions of people. Okay, I do not assess that it is possible whatsoever to divide America by trying to heighten the differences with 100 trolls. So there he goes. And finally, reinforcing audience bias is exactly what Facebook and Google have been doing on a vast scale by algorithmically preying on people's existing biases to increase engagement, and YouTube as well. In a more traditional manner, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post are doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's about building an audience engagement, and sometimes you do that through spam, through junk, through memes, through hoaxes, through fake news, intentional fake news. And my point has always been on this, Mike, and we'll move on. Listen, when you see something on Facebook, people, and it says Pope Francis has just endorsed Donald Trump, okay? If you believe that on face value, chances are you're what they call a low information voter, or you're probably not even registered to vote anyway, and it's not going to affect your voting at all. So to think there's never been any proof presented to poll the people who have voted to see who had seen any of these so-called famous fake news memes in the run-up to the election and how they actually voted. So there's no sort of empirical correlation at all that's ever been attempted or presented. All these university programs, they're doling out, Mike, millions and millions of dollars for people doing research projects on how to spot and how to manage and how to combat fake news. Meanwhile, they haven't even proved the premise to begin with. It's a total fraud.
And to add insult to injury then, we're expected to believe that somebody has been sent home from the Russian Olympic team, Winter Olympics team, from the curling team.
Curling.
For taking performance-enhancing drugs. Now, he has gone home. I don't know whether he's taken performance-enhancing drugs or not, but everybody else amongst the Winter Olympic curling teams are asking, why would anyone dope in our sport? It is not a physical performance related sport, really, is it?
It's all wrist action, isn't it? So unless they've got some special steroid that you can inject into your wrist or something, so...
No, he has been accused of taking the same drug that Sharapova took.
Yeah.
So
they're so ruthless, aren't they, those Russians? They'll do anything to win,
anything,
even
yes.
at curling. Amazing.
But of course, as we mentioned a week or so ago, it's not just the Russians in the United States that are continuing to get the hard time. It's now also the Chinese. But this follows the comments from FBI Director Christopher Wray, who was speaking at a U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee hearing last Tuesday. That there's so many Chinese spies now spreading throughout the U.S. a whole of society threat. Of course, these are non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students. We see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country. It's not just in major cities, it's in small ones as well. It's across basically every discipline. So it's not just the Russians, Patrick, it's also the Chinese, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Because, they must be breeding like rabbits as well. But he also said that the FBI was monitoring Confucius institutes and also Chinese education programs that are aiming to promote language and culture. Well, this is the United Chinese Americans body, the body that speaks for the Chinese in America. They have called these remarks deeply troubling, of grave concern among Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. They say painting all Chinese students and indeed all Chinese in America with such a broad brush as a national security threat is paranoid, inflammatory, un-American and simply wrong. Although we agree that we must do our very best to strengthen national security, doing so by ethnically profiling a whole community and by invoking a whole of society American response would not only damage the constitutional rights and rule of law that all Americans hold sacred, it could also be counterproductive and indeed damaging to the very efforts of strengthening our national security. So that doesn't really pull any punches.
So Russiagate is falling apart as we said it would, and so now it's Chinagate. So they're going after the Chinese community. There's a Chinese takeaway in every single village and hamlet on the planet, actually.
Yeah.
But let me say, if Marco Rubio and the FBI director want to target the Chinese community, if the Chinese community pulled their children out of American universities, guess what would happen to a large, especially in California, what would happen to the university system? It would probably go bankrupt. So these are some of the best, most qualified, high-performing students in the United States, and the ones coming from overseas as well. So it's ridiculous. The Chinese community in America is a long-established community, really since the 1800s, actually. So you have to question the fact that Marco Rubio actually ran for president, which is astonishing when he's making statements like this. Amazing.
Right. Now, Patrick, mainstream media, we have had a lot to say about its fall from grace, and it continues to fall to even greater depths. Let's bring the Mirror on screen. The headline is Secrets of the Deep State, Donald Trump's favorite conspiracy theory explained. They say the deep state refers to a clandestine network within the government, the intelligence, national security services, the military, and major financial institutions. The theory is that these elite operators are the ones who really control the government from behind the scenes. They're the man behind the curtain. Think of any conspiracy theory you've ever heard of, from the JFK assassination and the invasion of Iraq to the fake moon landings and 9/11. Below, being an inside job, and when you dig down deep enough, the deep state is probably behind it. The main function of the deep state, they say, is to maintain the status quo. They act to protect the interests of the establishment, be it Washington, D.C.'s political elites, the military and intelligence services' ability to snoop on citizens and act with relative impunity overseas, or the Wall Street's capacity to keep making tons of money. Operating outside the law, the deep state ensures the power lies not with the people, but with the elite. And they go on to ask, is the deep state real? And they say probably to a certain extent. They say there's certainly resistance to change at the top levels of government establishment. There's a way things are done in Washington, D.C., and Trump plays by a very different set of rules. In the US, as in the UK, there's a revolving door of people moving from military jobs to government jobs to jobs in the arms industry and the banking sector. Right? So this is the thing. But the key quote, I think there, Patrick, was, think of a conspiracy, of any conspiracy you've ever heard of, from the JFK assassination to the invasion of Iraq. Right. Well, I don't think we need to go any further than that, because, as you pointed out, it was the Mirror, which was the only UK paper which stuck on the issue of the invasion of Iraq. And here we've got one of their sign this page and send it back to us sort of petition things. No war was what they were calling for. They didn't consider that that was a conspiracy theory in 2003. And
there was another headline from another Mirror at the time, pre-Iraq war, that said, it's a hoax, basically. This is what the Mirror said. So they ended up getting stitched up through a nice little scam that was played on the editor, Piers Morgan, at the time, which ended in his ouster. But what's interesting about that Mirror article with Trump and the deep state, they deride Trump and castigate anyone who believes in a deep state, and then they confirm the deep state at the bottom of the article. So this is a total spin and mind games, really, by the media. It's extraordinary.
So the question is how far they can fall, and perhaps Vanessa Bailey gives us a clue.
Well, if you go to 21st Century Y today and look at this article, this certainly is an eye-opener in terms of we're wondering how mainstream media journalists are managing to be free and move nicely with Al-Qaeda, with al-Nusra, with ISIS. Some tend to report without any problems, and others are beheaded. So there's two that we're featuring in this, two Guardian correspondents, Martin Chuloff and Kareem Shaheen, are two of the people that Vanessa is looking into a little bit deeper. And Martin Chuloff is amazing. We're wondering, between James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, Serena Shim, Theo Padnos, and so many others that were either captured, killed, or worse. And so it's amazing. And Chuloff would call the Syrian Arab Army a medieval brutality, decry their medieval brutality, without ever mentioning the fact that terrorists in East Aleppo had been sieging and shelling people in West Aleppo, killing over 11,000 civilians, many of them children, all documented, by the way, unlike the White Helmets. All of these victims have names and there's details about their conditions. So it's a good question. Are they embedded with al-Nusra? So in a sense, they're telling the story and helping to support the terrorist cause. So the question then is, if a Western journalist is promoting al-Nusra or is being an apologist for ISIS, for instance, is that not in violation of UK, US, international law? Possibly. It is, actually. So this is a good question. And so I think a bit of disclosure might be in order here for these reporters. What exactly is their relationship with these terrorist groups?
Okay, well, sticking with the media to some degree anyway. Last week, many of the UK newspapers had a similar headline to this one. This is the Times. It says, charity sex scandal, UN staff responsible for 60,000 rapes in a decade. And some people asked why we didn't cover this at the time. And really the main reason was because we weren't certain about the statistic itself. We weren't certain about the headline, and we weren't certain about the use of the word rape. And so to a certain degree, this is a fake news story. There's no question about that, and I want to explain why. Now, the United Nations was pushing this out today, zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, the source of the statistic that was used in the mainstream headlines is an academic called Andrew MacLeod. And he didn't make the statement in quite the way that the mainstream media portrayed it. Now, he has been published, I think, in the Telegraph in recent months, presenting a similar position, but he was a bit more careful in how he described it. Now, the UN said in this document here, in the address to the high-level meeting on the United Nations response to sexual exploitation and abuse back in early part of last year, they said that in 2016 there had been 145 sexual abuse allegations, which affected 311 victims during the course of 2016. So that was 311 victims in 1 year. That was, again, those were allegations that were made against staff on missions. So this was people that were on peacekeeping and political missions and not regular, normal United Nations staff, civilian staff, as you might call them. MacLeod then extrapolated that statistic somewhat because what he did was the Secretary General, Guterres, had said in September last year that the majority of sexual abuse from UN staff comes from civilian staff and not from peacekeeping staff. So he then made the assumption that if there were 311 victims as a result of peacekeeping staff, but Guterres is saying the majority was not peacekeeping staff, he basically took 600 cases as being a basic level of abuse. And then because sexual assault is what is considered an underreported crime, he decided to estimate that only 10% of sexual assaults are reported. So he then decided that was 6,000 cases in total in 2016. And then the media decided that makes 60,000 over 10 years. But the media then, it was a pretty speculative thing that he's done here, right? And he said so in anything that I've seen that he wrote. But when the media took it up, they took the speculation aspect of it out somewhat, or at least he didn't make it clear. But the other thing was that he said sexual assault, he didn't say rape, and he was including people that were paying for sex while they were on operational duty, right? So it wasn't just sexual assault; it was also use of prostitutes and so on, and it certainly wasn't limited to rape. That was absolute fake news by the mainstream media to use that word.
So there's the Times, Rupert Murdoch's Times, basically pushing a clickbaity fake news headline. This is amazing. So the question then, Mike, is if the Times and a high-level newspaper is willing to twist and to distort the facts in order to make some kind of a big impression on the reader and mislead them, can you trust them on something like climate change? Can you trust them on something like government policy? This is a good question.
Absolutely. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that Andrew MacLeod is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that he has made an extrapolation of a statistic. The truth is that nobody knows what the true level of rape is from people that are working for the United Nations, and nobody knows what the true level of sexual exploitation or sexual abuse is among people that are working for the United Nations. That's something that I absolutely support Andrew MacLeod in campaigning to find out, because the United Nations is completely opaque on this situation, and we should know. So there's work for them to do, as there is with many other charities. Now, the Evening Standard pushed this out. Oxfam scandal report reveals sacked staff accused of sexual abuse were given new charity jobs despite warnings. Now, this, it has to be said, was known about pretty much as soon as the Oxfam scandal broke. Oxfam claimed at the time that they would not have given positive references for anybody going to get a new job. It is pretty despicable that these people are getting jobs within the charity sector despite warnings. But then the question in my mind is, Brendan Cox has just resigned. This is the husband of Joe Cox, the MP that was murdered apparently how long ago was it? 2 years, perhaps?
Right before Brexit, yeah, before the referendum.
He has resigned from charities amid sexual assault claims. What's his next job going to be? It's possibly a bit more difficult because this is such a high-profile resignation. But I think it's fair to say that he should not be in a position where he is coming in contact with people that may be vulnerable.
Well, I can suggest a couple of job opportunities for Brendan Cox. Maybe he's a big supporter of the white helmets. Why not go to Idlib province, put on the white helmet, and get stuck in?
That's a very good idea. Very good idea.
A bit of field work for the NGO sector. I think
yes,
that'd be good.
Okay, and we'll end on this one. Shocking scale of sexual abuse at UK boarding schools revealed by ITV documentary. This is an ITV documentary. They're saying that it's in a program called Exposure, I should say. It's going to be broadcast on Monday. Journalist and author Alex Renton, who was sexually abused as an 8-year-old boy by a teacher. They have discovered that since 2012, 425 people have been accused of carrying out sexual attacks at UK boarding schools. Not every police force could provide further details, but at least 160 people have been charged so far. At least 171 of the total number were accused of historical abuse. And since 2012, at least 125 people have been accused by children of recent sex attacks at boarding schools. And there are 31 ongoing investigations. Just over half of the police forces that were asked about this responded, meaning that the total figure is likely to be higher. The question is, where is this all going to end?
Well, in terms of the boarding school scandal, Mike, some of those revelations don't come out until decades, sometimes decades after the fact. So it's a very long process. But judging by the amount of cases, if you go by the previous author of the UN document, that only a certain amount are reported. What do you say, 10%?
No, well, that was an estimate.
It's an estimate, yeah. But it's a low percentage,
yes.
Probably. So the scale of this problem is, it could be immense, but maybe we'll never know exactly how big it is.
And finally, Patrick, Essex Police seem to be up to no good.
Well, this was kindly sent to us on social media by one of our readers. Dispersal order for Colchester to help tackle antisocial behavior. So apparently there's fights and bottles being thrown the other night at 3 a.m. And so from, I believe it's the 19th, from 1830, that's 6:30 p.m., until the following day. There's a cordon sanitaire in downtown Colchester, I think, or no, it's after, in the evening.
This is otherwise known as a curfew?
Yeah, so it's a curfew, but during this time, but it's an open curfew in the sense that police will now be able to arrest or detain anybody who they believe might be involved in a disturbance. So not only people who are causing trouble, but who the police think might
In the future?
In the future, who knows, in the future that day or whatever. So this is new police powers being exercised here. Nobody's really taking much notice of this. So I would be a little bit worried that this could become policy.
Future crime, pre-crime.
Pre-crime, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. We will leave it there. It's time to go for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us by taking out a membership or making a donation. We can only do what we do with your help, and it's very much appreciated. So thank you very much. We will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.